Okay, so I think what we do, I'd like to ask kind of one overarching question, then open it up and take a couple of questions from the audience, and then really just have each of you respond, to those questions um, as you see fit. I guess what I want to do is come back a little bit to a question that Ed Luck used to sort of frame the final part of your remarks, which was you said it more eloquently, but what would happen now if what we saw in Rwanda were to happen again? And what I think I want to use that question for is to really focus on where we are in terms of our potential to prevent. And I mentioned a couple quick things. I thought it was really useful that Ed Luck emphasized the first two pillars of the R2P. I think these get very little attention in the public imagination, but in fact are really important, things that we can do that may allow us in some situations never to get to the point of thinking about more drastic kinds of intervention. But we still face the possibility that those things won't be effective in certain circumstances and that violence will begin, atrocities will begin. And I think that's the question I really want to ask. What is our ability now? Is it different? What are the prospects for stopping atrocity once they begin? And what we've talked about a little bit is the difficulty of getting Security Council action. I think some have interpreted the R2P doctrine to leave at least some room for other forms of collective action than Security Council authorized action, or even unilateral action. And I think we often look back to Rwanda as the simple way of saying, well, if despite the likelihood that France would have prevented Security Council action, if the United States or some other country had said, doesn't matter, we're going to go in anyway, and it prevented a large amount of this atrocity, would we look back historically and criticize that country for having violated international law? Probably not. We have the example of Kosovo, where the Commission of Inquiry said it was unlawful but legitimate, a strange and troubling legal concept that leaves us not sure where we are. So I guess the question I have, when we still have the UN Charter saying, domestic jurisdiction, sovereignty still hold, the Security Council really being the only alternative, what is our potential for intervening when something happens? And then next to that, I want to talk a little bit about Zach's focus on retrospective justice in a way, transitional justice. To the extent that relates to prevention, I think it's largely been based on a theory that through the establishment of the ICC now, I think most people view that as replacing the need for ad hoc tribunals, although not necessarily, or perhaps through universal jurisdiction, that we have a powerful force for deterring future atrocity. But again, I guess I would like to have us think a little bit about where we are in terms of these forms of justice actually serving us as means of prevention when we see prospects of mass atrocity. So I'd like to keep those questions in mind and then open it up. And I don't know if you can see better than I can see. I guess I can see if I cover up the light. So let's open it up to questions, and then we'll ask our panelists to go and respond to whatever they would like to. Yes. No.
Did the U.S. have any information leading up to the genocide, and could it have been prevented, in your opinion? And could the scale of the violence have at all been foreseen?
Okay. We'll take a couple more questions, and then we'll turn to our panelists.
As you know, Rhonda Kaufman and the Women's Caucus for the International Criminal Court were very influential in creating a court that would address violence against women as this one has. However, since then, as Ambassador Chandre reminded us last week at a side event at the CSW, the Security Council has passed Resolution 1321 and a series of other resolutions in terms of the role of women in the peace process and in conflict situations. Yet not one woman, even though the EC Council recommended it from Syria, has been part of the peace negotiations. So I am curious as to whether or not women played a role in the gotcha, which was brought to our attention by graduate students here at one point, and why you think that happens and whether that could affect the process and the outcomes and leave another legacy.
David right here, and then I think then we'll shift to our panel to respond to these questions.
Yes, it was both stated and implied that the Obama administration should have taken some sort of direct action in Syria. I'm wondering what that action might have been in the estimation of the panel.
Okay, so why don't we go in the same order? And yeah, I think.
Great. Very good questions. Jim, I think you really posed two questions in a sense. Where are we in the effort to develop better prevention mechanisms and utilize them? And then what are the prospects once violence starts? What are the prospects beyond the Security Council? And in terms of both of those, I thought the one thing that was sort of missing from the conversation so far were regional arrangements and sub-regional arrangements. And I think they're enormously important. And I guess the way it was set up, no one really was addressing what's happened regionally. But I think the African Union's acceptance of non-indifference as a philosophy as opposed to non-interference was a major shift and very important psychologically. I think the Article 4H in the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which actually preceded the invention of the Responsibility to Protect, because that was agreed in 2000, that there in fact is an obligation for collective intervention, including by military force, in the case of grave circumstances. And the grave circumstances had 3 of the 4 crimes that then were adopted by R2P. The one that wasn't there was ethnic cleansing. So I think that's quite significant, and also the ECOWAS efforts in Liberia and the regional and global efforts in Sierra Leone. So I think in many ways the tragic events in Rwanda sparked a regional response. That regional response then made it much easier for the UN to move forward. And certainly politically, we never would have gotten R2P if it wasn't for African support. And so I think that piece is worth looking at, both in terms of prevention and when violence starts. Because there have been a number of occasions, including those in ECOWAS, where the regional action was taken without prior authorization from the Security Council, whatever the charter says. So that's been interpreted fairly liberally, that they sort of report to the council afterwards rather than before. That, I think, has been a very important change. No, I think there is a major change, and I have always argued that R2P is basically a political concept. It has some legal niceties, but the law was already there. And it is a question about priorities. It's a question about values, and the question about standards of what we expect of ourselves, our neighbors, and our societies. And the question about trying to stop atrocity, the assumption that you should stop atrocities, is relatively new, and I think largely stems from Rwanda. So yes, Syria is very, very frustrating. And as I mentioned, I spent a long time on Syria within the UN. But to the last question, I don't think there are any easy answers. I think an argument could have been made that early on the US and others should have, 1, done a better job of sorting out who's who in the opposition, and 2, arming and training those who were so-called more moderate, more domestic in some ways, opposition in Syria. It might have been a positive in the end. I'm not sure that military intervention per se would have been particularly useful in the end. And I don't think it would have had sustainable support from the American public. But what I found, and this again goes to sort of prevention in a way, I was actually the first ranking UN official to say what was happening in Syria was a crime against humanity. And then not too far after that, the High Commissioner for Human Rights said that. That didn't make much difference. But if you could have, and didn't succeed in, persuaded those working on the negotiations with Syria to make protection, human protection, one of the top priorities in the negotiations, I think it might have made some difference. Now, my argument was, quite frankly, that one of the things that should be emphasized in negotiation was the need to protect minorities in Syria, including the Alawites as a small minority. And Syria was the only case that we dealt with directly where I thought there was unfortunately, fairly high possibility of true genocide at the end of the day. And Assad's claim to fame was that he was providing protection for minorities, including, obviously, first and foremost, the Alawites. But, we did internal papers, and from the top, there's a lot of interest in this. But I must say, going around to members of the Security Council, a lot of them said, yeah, there was actually, pretty good arguments. But the Western countries didn't want it because they said it was feeding into Assad's line that the problem was protection of minorities. And so we politically couldn't accept that. The Russians and Chinese said, well, sort of interesting arguments, but it's tied to R2P, and we don't really want to emphasize that. So you couldn't get any political traction. But I think that could have changed things a little bit in terms of the staying power of the Assad regime and his ability to hold all these minorities together. I just wanted to leave you one little quote from San Francisco, 1945, which I dug up somewhere in doing research for a lecture, actually, the Secretary General was giving at Oxford in 2011. And that is the drafting committee in San Francisco in 1945 in explaining the wording of Article 2.7, which everyone sees as a great protection for sovereignty. They actually said that if fundamental freedoms and rights are, quote, grievously outraged so as to create conditions which threaten peace or to obstruct the application of the provisions of the Charter, then they cease to be the sole concern of each state. So this is fundamental freedoms and rights grievously outraged. It ceases to be the sole concern of each state. This is in 1945. So I don't think these ideas of looking at sovereignty a little more broadly are so new. It's just a lot of countries, a lot of regimes, a lot of leaders found it awfully convenient to hide behind 2.7 and some of these other procedures, even though that very, very strict interpretation of sovereignty that you can do whatever you want to your population was not what actually was intended when the Charter was drafted in 1945.
So it's already 3:15, so I'm going to be very quick. I don't think it would have made any difference in Syria what language was put into any UN resolution. I don't think it would have made any difference if there were any women who were among the peace negotiators. I think the only question is whether or not Assad's own calculus, which was a calculus about his own capacity to survive, could have been changed. Now, if I had to guess, I would say whatever the United States failed to do, had it done it, probably would not have worked. But there was a decent enough chance that it might have worked, that given the consequences of doing nothing, it should have been tried. My quick definition of it would not have been very different from what Ed suggested, which was certainly a more significant support for moderate rebels, which would have meant lethal aid as well as non-lethal aid. It probably would have meant money. You just give these guys money, they're going to buy the guns and the ammunition someplace else. They won't have a problem finding it if they have the money. Should there have been an attempt to destroy Syria's capacity to do damage from the air? I think so. And I think given what we see now about their use of helicopters in order to drop barrel bombs, to kill thousands of people, the idea that that was somehow beyond the pale of NATO and the U.S. Air Force, I find kind of hard to fathom. So let me stop there.
Exactly.
I'll respond to a few of the different questions. Also, one is about the prospects for stopping atrocities today. Is there any reason to believe that they're different than in the past, specifically in '94? I think yes, in some ways. Aside from the fact that political will may remain challenging, or maybe the biggest stumbling block, one improvement that we do have is technology. So it's much more difficult today for people in positions of authority to claim that they didn't know what was happening at the time. This was borne out, I think, very illustratively in the case of the Arab Spring, where and also more recently in Syria, where members of civil society are using social media to wonderful end to expose atrocities. I want to respond to the question about what we knew at the time, what the U.S. government, rather, knew at the time in the case of Rwanda. The U.S. government, and I want to say this as clearly as I can, the U.S. government knew that there was a genocide occurring in Rwanda. I've been researching this now for about almost 20 years, and it seems very clear through both declassified documents that I've obtained as well as interviews that I've conducted with people who were making decisions at the time. One example is that Prudence Bushnell, who was one of the senior officials in the State Department at the time, was actually speaking with some of the perpetrators as well as some of the leaders of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, in particular Paul Kagame, who's now the president of Rwanda, discussing what was happening in Rwanda and threatening them, not threatening the Hutu. Saying, we are watching what you're doing, and they, the response was even, we're flattered that the American government cares. Please say hello to your president. Does it mean that the Rwandan government or the Rwandan genocide, the genocide against the Tutsi, could have been prevented? I think yes. At the very least, it could have been mitigated. There were certain steps that could have been taken to significantly mitigate the fallout, the effects of the genocide. Proactive steps were taken to reduce the United Nations assistance missions, the peacekeeping missions' presence. The troops were withdrawn. Romeo Dallaire, the commanding force, the force commander, his mandate was constricted. If his mandate was expanded, if they were allowed to engage, if the troops themselves had been bolstered, if they had given more equipment, then certainly the genocide could have been significantly mitigated. Other steps that could have been taken, some talk about bombing the radio station, or at least jamming it. That the radio in particular was so critical to, again, inciting and orchestrating the genocide by even telling people where Tutsi were hiding, which ones to target, that if you had blocked that mechanism of communication, of governmental direction, instruction, that would have helped enormously. On the point of the ICC, just to respond to one of Jim Silk's questions, where are we with the ICC? Certainly there have been improvements in the fact that we now have a standing mechanism for both deterrence as well as avoiding startup costs with the proliferation of other mechanisms. However, there's lots of reasons to still be concerned. So first of all, the ICC has no enforcement mechanism of itself. It's a treaty, it's its own court. It's not part of the United Nations, although it has some relationships. And so even if it issues arrest warrants, there's no standing force to institute them. It relies on the goodwill of its signatories and other partners to follow through, but arrest warrants have been issued in the case of, for example, the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, and yet he remains at large, and some believe committing atrocities. Part of the problem, of course, is that not all states have signed on, and not all states who have even signed on have followed through with their responsibilities. One state, of course, that hasn't signed on is the United States government, as well as other powerful states around the world, which certainly minimizes or reduces the ICC's effectiveness. A final note about women in transitional justice. While it's unclear, I certainly agree with Jim, it's unclear to what extent having more women in the role in the process of dealing with Syria would have done, what more that would have achieved. It's very clear in the case of Rwanda that women have been absolutely critical to the recovery of Rwanda since. We're going to hear from two individuals I greatly admire in the next panel, Yvette and Console. But Rwanda in general, this is an amazing statistic, now has more women in parliament than any country in the world. Women in many ways have led the recovery of Rwanda. And in that way, women really need to be acknowledged for the role that they play and celebrated as such. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the first panel, and to Jim.